All right, so what we're going to do in this video is take a look, a deep dive, if you will, into Redshift's render settings so that we can get rid of as much noise as possible while keeping our render times as low as possible. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so I got just a sample scene here, just some random objects that, I found from the content browser just to give us some variety here with the types of materials we have. And for this, I'm not a huge fan of using the IPR. I want to use the Redshift render view for a couple of different reasons. One, it seems to be a bit more responsive, at least on my machine. But two, it will make things a little bit smaller and easier to kind of manage as we go through and do this. So you can dock the Redshift render view here. And the other thing I want to pull up is my Redshift render settings. And these are just like your basic default render settings, okay? And so it'll give us a chance to kind of start and go through this process as much as possible. So when you first create or switch a renderer to Redshift, you are in the basic section. And what that means here is in order to increase the quality, you have the low, medium, high, and very high or custom presets. In fact, you can't change custom yet until you twirl down bucket quality. And so this is one of the things I mentioned in my how to kind of make Redshift work faster video or tips for it is rather than just kind of use these presets, you can actually change the value in between these presets, okay? And that can be a way to get a little bit better quality without taking the penalty or the render hit you would by just going up to the next highest preset. The problem with this though, the basic mode here is that it does apply it to everything. And so that can be very time consuming and is not necessarily the most efficient way to do this. Now, before we get too far though, we also need to realize in order to see the final quality of our image, we don't want to be looking at the progressive renderer down here. Instead, we need to be using bucket renderer. Okay, so that bucket renderer is a little bit different approach to rendering. It is the production renderer. It's what you will see if you render to your picture viewer or render a full image here. But this is going to be the best way for us to gauge what our final quality settings look like. I will be zooming in a lot here. And, at some point you may go, well, why are you so close? And it's because I'm trying to see the noise. And regardless of when I see that noise, I do want to consider how zoomed in I am. Because if I'm at 1200%, that noise is probably not going to be visible at 100%. So the first step here, in order to optimizing our render settings, is not to use these presets. And the way you do that is by going to the advanced section and unchecking automatic sampling. And when you do that, you're going to get some other options here, okay? If I uncheck it, you get your samples min and max. You also get your overrides. There's a few different ways you can approach this. I'm going to stick primarily with the overrides, but I will point out the alternative, which is actually even more involved than using the override section here. So what are we looking at? We have the samples min and samples maximum. Okay, Redshift is going to take a look at your image, take a look at pixels, even subpixels, and it's going to compare the values of those, right? The contrast. And it is going to try and subdivide them as much as it can until it reaches or has subdivided them 16 times if it hasn't met that threshold. Now that actually isn't the default threshold. So let me just switch to basic, go to medium. There we go, because that's the normal amount for that threshold. And I do want to point that out because we will talk more about this property later on. But essentially what the threshold value does is it makes Redshift work harder, use more max samples, or if you increase this, it will use more of the minimum samples. And I use this as a last resort, as you will see. So this is our global quality settings here. And we want this to do as little work as possible. All right, so we want to use these overrides or per light or per material options for these types of properties as much as possible and let the automatic sampler do as little as unified sampling, as little as possible. Really just kind of the anti-aliasing is all we want to see. Anti-aliasing, motion blur, as well as depth of field if you have those options turned on and you're using them. So what I'll do here then is start with my image at its most basic. And so I'm going to get that process going here by switching the mode to clay. That way I'm not looking at any materials. I also want to come in here, turn off global illumination. So that way I don't have any global illumination. I will then come here to my scene null in my lights and turn off all my lights. And so now we just have our flat, boring, plain geometry. And I want to take a look at this and see how things look. Is there any obvious anti-aliasing? And I'm not sure how well this is coming through in the video, so I'll zoom in a bit more, but you know, this line is not perfectly crisp or clean, and some of that is due to my minimum and maximum samples here. So that is what I'm mostly concerned with when it comes to my minimum max. For everything else, material, lighting wise, ambient occlusion, you name it, I'm going to use overrides or per light, per material options. So what I'm going to do here is set my samples max to something like 512. The values you want to use for any of these samples properties are going to be powers of 2. So that's 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, 4096, and that's about as high as I can go. The good news is if you don't have all those memorized, you can type in simple math. So I could do 4 times 2. I could do 8 times 2, and it's going to do the math for me. So what I want here is to try and find a minimum value that is going to give me a clean, crisp image, but is not really overkill either. And if I just take these back down a bit, we'll see, once again, hopefully, you know, how these lines do end up looking a bit better. So I'll set this back to 512. That probably won't do a whole lot. It really is this minimum here that it's going to take to really start to see that detail come back in. And once I'm happy with something like this, I can go ahead and move to the next step. Okay. And that next step is going to be to turn on a light, one light at a time. So I'm going to start with my area light here. And at this point, what I'm doing is looking at shadows. Now this clay is a great place to start, but you can actually separate or break things down even more. I don't think I'll need to for shadows, but let me just go through that process because I'm going to want these later. I'm going to go to my AOV section. I'm going to click Show AOV Manager, and I'm going to add the AOVs for all of these overrides, my reflection, refraction, ambient occlusion, shadows, subsurface scattering, and global illumination, which allows me to see just that as well. And honestly, if you do the AOVs, you almost don't really need to use these the clay render after we get the lights and global illumination turned on. Okay, so we'll do ambient occlusion first. Now, this is not a blanket ambient occlusion pass. I am using an AO node in a material, which is where this ambient occlusion is going to be pulled from. Let's see, what else do we want? Global illumination. We want reflections. We want refractions and subsurface scattering. Perfect. So I got all those there. Okay. And what I'm looking for in my light AOV or my light here is in the details section, you have a light samples property. And so if you have more than one light, I do recommend setting the light samples individually, because what ends up happening is these overrides apply to every light, every reflection property, every refraction or material with subsurface scattering. So whatever value I set here, whatever number of samples is going to get applied to both of these lights. Whatever value I use in my reflection will be applied to every material with reflection. And for materials, I get it. It's a little bit cumbersome to go through and maybe do those individually, but lights, we really only have 2 of them. And if you have one light that is contributing the majority of the illumination you're seeing, that's probably the one you need to adjust the samples the most. And the other one is probably going to have significantly fewer samples. So in this case, it's actually my area light, which is contributing the most. And so if I zoom in here, we can see I do have quite a bit of noise. I could also use my, I forgot to add my shadow AOV, which isn't as big of a deal, but might as well add it. There we go. It'll go through and render that. So shadows, and you can see we have some noise in there. And sometimes it's just a little bit easier to see that noise. I also want to point out with these AOVs, with this clay render, it is absolute worst case scenario. And when you combine, the global illumination and your material properties and your lights and all of that other stuff, that this noise isn't going to be as visible as it is here. So I'm not trying to get it perfect either in my AOV or the clay render. Instead, I want to get it as clean as possible. And if I toggle back and forth to look at my beauty, that can give me a sense if I've cleaned up the noise enough. But I'll stick with clay in here, and in my area light, like I said, light samples. And one thing you want to think about here is if you have automatic sampling turned on, those sample properties disappear. So if you can't find them, that is probably why. Okay, and I would just start by raising my samples. And for the interest of time, I'm going to skip a little bit higher, but I do recommend starting low. You never know just how many samples you'll need to get rid of the noise, but I've worked with this scene a few times now, so I know I'm going to really need to get something like 1024 to start seeing the noise improve. I'll do ×2, 2048, starting to improve, and maybe one more for right now, 4096. Look around, see if I'm noticing any other noise, and I still see a little bit here and there. I could double this if I wanted to. Every scene is different. So depending on the scale of your scene, the lighting, all right, values can vary. I typically don't have to use values this high, but if that's what it takes in this scene to get rid of the noise, then so be it. Okay. And that's helped quite a bit. Is it perfect? No, I think it's good enough for right now. I could always check my shadow pass as well. And that's looking quite a bit cleaner as well. Perfect. Okay. What I'll do now is switch lights, turn off my area light, turn on my dome light. Now my dome light is actually quite dark. It's actually not contributing a lot here. Really wish it was contributing more. But for getting rid of noise, I am going to increase its exposure so I can just see a bit more. Help get rid of any noise it's creating. So I increased my EV, my exposure value here, just because it'll be very easy for me to reset after. I can then come in here to my details section again and increase my samples. I know it's, at least 2048 where I want to start with this scene, but I would have no problem starting lower if, I'm just doing this for the first time or I'm still getting used to this process. So, all right, still seeing some noise. I think we can do a little bit better. Okay, seems to be working pretty good. And I'm going to turn on my area light now. This is going to be probably way too bright, but this is kind of a good way to just see how things look now with both lights on before I make one darker. So still maybe a little bit of noise on that back wall, maybe some noise there, but overall I think this looks good. And I'll just reset the intensity on my dome light now. Great. So we've done lighting. Next up is global illumination. And I do like to use the GI pass for this. So I'll switch to that. Come back in here and turn on my global illumination settings. Now, I don't plan on going through, every setting in its entirety, but I primarily just stick with the default engines here. So for primary, brute force, secondary, irradiance, and I just want to increase my brute force raise. That's the global illumination equivalent of samples. So this is pretty dark. So, can probably a bit tricky to see, especially on the video, but I'm seeing some noise there, and I'll just start by turning these up. Right. Not seeing much of a difference with that. I also want to mention that there is a very technical way the minimum and maximum samples work together in combination with overrides. There is more to it than what I'm getting into, but this is kind of the basics, if you will, of the Redshift render settings. And so there's multiple levels here when it comes to getting familiar with these and getting everything you can out of Redshift and getting your render times down as much as possible. Back in global illumination though, I'm going to try maybe a bit higher. And, once I see what this looks like here, because it's, really difficult for me to see, I will probably switch back to my beauty and kind of get a sense of what it looks like, if there's any more noise, less noise. Honestly, I don't think there's that much global illumination here in general. You know, most of the lighting is direct lighting, and I can tell that because if I uncheck global illumination, the scene doesn't really change all that much. So global illumination isn't contributing a whole lot, so I probably don't need to go crazy with my brute force rays. I definitely think I went a bit overkill trying to clean up the noise in my AOV, where that noise really just isn't noticeable in our clay render here. And if it's not noticeable in the clay render, it's probably not going to be noticeable in our full render that we're going to go back to right now. So I'll turn off my clay render, and depending on what type of cards or GPU you have, not a bad idea to just switch to region render, and that will allow us to focus on different parts of our image without having to render the whole thing. In fact, I do have a whole video about speeding up Redshift, mainly for preview purposes. So definitely check out that video if you want some more tips for working with Redshift. Now, material-wise here, we have subsurface scattering. I have refraction with roughness. I have reflection with roughness. I have ambient occlusion here. And so that's really what we're going to be, looking at with these materials. And we'll see that in the AOV. Now, like I said, we will be using the overrides for reflections, for refractions. It doesn't really matter for ambient occlusion in this case, and subsurface scattering. But think about the fact that in my material manager right now, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different reflective materials. And so if I increase the samples here in this overrides, it is increasing the samples on all 8 of those materials. And, that's not going to be very efficient if it's really just 1 or 2 that are giving me issues or where I'm seeing noise and grain. And the way you can fix that is in this type of material, the new kind of node editor. You have a samples property right here for reflection. A little bit lower, you have the samples property for refraction and transmission. And in subsurface, you will notice that there is a samples setting in there. So that's where you can change it per material. For time purposes in this video, I will just be using these overrides, but if you really care about every fraction of a second when it comes to your render time, do it per material, do it per light, and don't use these overrides unless, it's only going to apply to one material. For instance, this is the only subsurface scattering material, this green material here. And so it doesn't really matter if I do it in this override or if I do it inside there. It's going to give me the exact same result and not apply to other materials. So cool. Here's what we have. Let's start with reflection. Though I'll be honest, my reflections look pretty clean, but we can switch to our reflections AOV just to maybe see a bit more noise. And what I'll do is turn on reflections for the override and come down here and increase the samples. Now there are a couple of different ways you can work with this. This will replace all these values. If you do scale, that is a multiplier. So if a material has 16 samples, like this one does, and this is set to 2, it's going to be 2 times 16, which is 32. What I want to do, though, is just start increasing this. And typically speaking, for overrides and really even light settings, global illuminations, I generally start about my max settings here, okay? So it has to do with the little bit more complicated math, the way these settings all work together, typically I find I don't get much of a difference until I'm at least at max settings there. And so that's starting to clean things up a little bit, not perfect. And I don't expect it to necessarily clean it up here, maybe as much as some of the other areas, but I just do the same thing, keep going. Right, toggling back and forth between my reflection AOV, my beauty pass, and keep turning this up until I'm happy or satisfied with the amount of noise. And from my experience, if I don't see any noise at 300%, then I'm typically good when it comes to 100%. Okay, but it does depend on the image size. Larger images, you're going to need to zoom in more to make sure that noise is gone. And speaking of noise, well, that's what we're primarily doing in this video, is adjusting our render settings to get rid of it. I want to point out we do have denoising. And that too can help with getting rid of noise. It's not perfect, especially in animations, but it can be very helpful in a pinch. So that's looking okay. I think I'll just go one more, and that should work for that. I'll work with my refraction now, so I'll switch to that. And we can see pretty darn noisy. Let's make this region smaller as well, since that's really the only place I'm concerned with. And just so we have a way to easily compare, I'm going to increase these very much. Another tip is you can save images, very much like Picture Viewer. In fact, you can save images to the Picture Viewer, but you can take snapshots and work with them directly in here. So for instance, I guess I said I wasn't going to do this, but I'll take a snapshot, I'll save this, and then as I increase this, and I'm going to increase it a lot so we can see the improvement here. One of the reasons why I haven't done this earlier is because with YouTube compressing the video, how much noise actually comes through is going to be different between what I'm seeing on my screen right now versus what will make it if you're watching this on YouTube. And there's unfortunately not much I can do. So you can see as I click off, it is better. It's not significantly better. I wouldn't call it clean yet, but we're getting there. And in fact, the render time went down. And that's another reason why I like using these snapshots, because you can kind of compare the render time. So let's double this again. Okay, and you almost have to have a short memory when it comes to working with these settings, because as I mentioned, what works in one scene is probably not going to work in another scene unless they're a very similar scale, unless the lighting setup is very similar. I typically use dome lights, and so I do think there's settings that a range of settings that seems to be more regular when you use dome lights as opposed to something like area lights or multiple lights. So that's probably why some of these values are a lot different than what I'm used to. And just for fun, I'll turn this up one more time to see how far we can push this. And like I said, worst case scenario is what we're seeing here in our AOV. I'm not sure I would actually want to go this high for a final render, but ultimately it comes down to what I'm seeing in my beauty pass. And so that looks pretty good. Maybe still a bit noisy. I am 250% zoomed in. So if I zoom out, looks pretty good. So I'm relatively happy with that. Let's skip over to do ambient occlusion, only because it's going to be a bit of a simpler process and quicker one. So ambient occlusion, this would apply not only to, say, the ambient occlusion node in a material here, which, as you might suspect, has its own samples, but also if you did an ambient occlusion AOV, which, you use the custom AOV, you use the AOV utility there to do that. So, it looks pretty good, right? Just before we even see the AOV, doesn't look too bad, but when I switch to my ambient occlusion, okay, maybe a bit more noise. And we'll just come here, increase our ambient occlusion samples in our override. Should clean it up a little bit. I was actually expecting it to do more. Not too bad. Why don't we double it one more time and be done with it. Definitely getting there. Awesome. So that would just leave me with subsurface scattering, which is this guy right here. Subsurface scattering, notorious for being difficult to clean up. And so we'll see what value we have to use here. I think it's going to be at least the 4096. Spoiler, it's going to be higher than that. Right, but we hopefully will start to see some improvement in here. And one of the things I've also kind of noticed, and I haven't found a really good explanation because everything I've seen says, not to do this, but it seems like these values seem to hit a ceiling if you don't have high enough minimum and maximum, but it's really more minimum setting. So, at some point there seems to be diminishing returns here. Oops. So let's see, I want to do times how many? 16 maybe. There we go. Let's see what we get with 8,000. Since that is what we're using for, I think, refraction. Oh, we're using 16. So we'll see what that looks like. You know, it seems to be improving a little bit. But like I said, you know, for this many samples, for having increased it this many times, I would have expected it to be a bit cleaner. And that is something I typically see with Redshift, is it seems to be a little bit tricky to get rid of that last bit of noise. So once I've gone through this process, right, you know, I can take a look at my beauty and say, yeah, there's still, you know, maybe more noise than I would like there. I do, you know, really one of two things. Okay, three things, I guess, if I'm, you know, going through all my options. One, denoising, if that's an option. However, if I am going to denoise this, I can typically lower my other settings. So it changes the whole approach I have to my render settings, because denoising something that's set up like this going to take, you know, longer than it really needs to. One of the other things I like to try is just turning down my threshold a little bit, making this a little bit more sensitive and pushing my samples towards the maximum that I've allowed it to do. Okay, and so that could potentially help as well. I don't know how much I actually changed it there. Okay, doesn't look like it made a huge difference. And then the other thing is, you know, come final render time, I'll just increase my settings a little bit. So maybe I just do a ×2. Honestly, I've started with these values in the past for this scene around here. So, you know, kind of wanted to see what happened if I went a little bit lower. But you can see, like, it doesn't really make a big impact on your render time. So, you know, there's nothing, I'm glad I went through and did this, but if I need to get rid of that last little bit of noise, increasing these just a touch isn't really going to make that much of a difference. So you can see 9 seconds here. All right. This one's definitely taking longer, but with that usually comes just a bit better quality. So 9 seconds, I actually think it went up a lot. Yeah, 15. So maybe I set that back to 256 and instead try 2048. Right. Setting these too close together doesn't let Redshift kind of do what it wants to do. And so now I'm even down to 7. So what happens if we do 4096? You know, what happens if I say 0, you know, 7 instead of 0, 1, 0, 0, 7. So those are kind of the final tweaks and adjustments I'll use to get something noise free. Right, and it looks like we've done a pretty good job, at least for this size of an image, which does happen to be the default 1280 by 720. Could totally be different for a 1920 by 1080, but yeah, that is how I work with my Redshift render settings. So that will do it for this video. If there's anything else you want to see, please let me know, and take care.